All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to an Independent Women's Policy Chat. I am Megan Mobbs, a senior fellow at Independent Women's Forum. I am super excited about this particular policy chat because we've received so many questions, and this has been a super hot topic in the news recently. And frankly, there is so much bad information out there, and it's hard to sift through it all and find out what the truth is. So, first, I'm going to introduce my incredible colleague, May, who we have here with us, and then we're going to dive right into the policy chat itself. So May is a former legal advisor to President Trump, where she advised on a wide range of policies, including healthcare, immigration, social issues. While in the White House, she also worked in the office of the Chief of Staff and the Staff Secretary's office. And then after the White House, May was Deputy Solicitor General for the state of Ohio and Vice President at Restoring Integrity and Trust in Elections. And now we are so lucky to have her as the director of the Independent Women's Law Center under Independent Women's. And she's here today really to help myth bust some of what's been said about what people have been referring to is the bipartisan border deal or the bipartisan border package. And now, to be very clear, bill was not just about the border. It was a 370-page, $118 billion bill that included Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan. We're going to get into a little bit of that. But the bottom line is it did not advance out of the Senate due to a lack of Republican support. And Speaker Johnson in the House stated effectively it would be dead on arrival in the House anyway. And the biggest argument has been that it contained kind of too many loopholes to effectively stop spiking migration at the southern border. But then you have President Biden in his speech at the State of the Union really laying the blame for the crisis, the border crisis, at the feet of the Republicans for not doing anything. So it's really important that we have this conversation and really dissect what actually was in the bill itself. So we're going to jump right in. And I guess, May, my first question for you is, I think we can all agree there is a crisis at the border, correct?
We can. I think at this point, even almost President Biden can acknowledge that there's a crisis at the border. He thinks it's the Republicans' fault, but I think he'll say that there is one. And if you look at the numbers, so in last fiscal year, 2023, the Biden administration reported 2.4 million illegal encounters at the border. And so that's between ports of entry and at ports of entry, people who, don't show that they have a right to be here. But that number is very low because that number doesn't include the number of gotaways. So there's known gotaways. We see them on the screen and we know that they're getting away, but we don't have people out there getting them. And then there's unknown gotaways. We assume that there are people coming across our border undetected, but we don't know how many and we don't know who they are. And then there's a whole group of people that are not apprehended at the border. They are welcomed in through mobile apps and various programs just directly into the United States. So 2.4 million sounds like a lot. It's actually a very small number. And in 2.4 million is the record. It's the yearly record. It only breaks the prior year record of 2.3 million. We broke the daily number record of 12,000 migrants being encountered in a single day. And I would say something that is average, it's not great, but average of how many people you'd expect to see at the border on a given day is historically about 1,200. I know that still sounds crazy high, but it is a huge border. We're unique in the world in that we border a third world country. So if you take 1,200 as like what's normal, and then compared to what we're seeing, definitely a crisis.
And I think that an important point that you kind of just brought up too, and I want you to explain if you can. I mean, thank you for explaining the difference between like kind of known gotaways, and all those different things that you kind of hear people throw out, but also ports of entry and between ports of entry. And I think oftentimes there's also a hyper focus on our southern border, but that's not the only port of entry here in the United States. So can you talk to that a little bit, what ports of entry actually mean between ports of entry, and then also, what we're seeing at the northern border, if you don't mind?
Yeah. So you can be an illegal alien coming anywhere, coming from land, from sea, across the border versus showing up to a port. So across the southern border, you're going to have various places where legal aliens and legal residents are supposed to go. You see this at Canada as well. But you can still show up to a port and say, I have no right to be in the United States. I have no documentation. I am an asylum seeker. And so at that point, you're not allowed to be in the United States, but you're basically claiming that you have a right. In fact, it's actually illegal to cross the southern border or the northern border out of a port of entry, even if you're a US citizen. So if you're a US citizen, you still have to use one of these ports. You can't just willy-nilly cross. You're not going to get charged for that,
Right.
but it's not lawful. Like, we need to have some sort of processing. And so the problem really is across the border. But the reason why between ports of entry is worse than at ports of entry is, if you present yourself for asylum at ports of entry, we, the United States, have some control. We can say, you know what, we are going to process 10 asylum claims today. And if you're not one of those 10, I'm sorry, like, the port is closed. But between ports of entry, this is where you're seeing all of the problems, because we have no control. We have no way of saying we're closed. And so this is where people are presenting themselves. They're not hiding. They're just showing up and saying, hello, I'm here to seek asylum. I know what I just did was illegal. And we do have the option to send people to jail at that point to say you were an illegal crosser. We're at least going to charge you with that misdemeanor. You're going to have it on your record, because if you cross illegally twice, then that's a felony and we can keep you for a while. So yeah, the problem is constant. The northern border doesn't see as much action, obviously, because Canada is not Mexico. It is not as easy to march up from the Northern Triangle there, but the northern border is just as long. It has just as many open spots, and it really is a matter of time before it becomes exploited as well.
Yeah, I think all that's super important. I feel like we should have another chat just talking about all of the different legal terms and what actually classifies all that. But I really want to make sure that, and this was my question, so I derailed us. I want to bring us back to the border bill, just because I think it's so important that Americans understand what was actually in it and why there was all this dialogue around whether or not it effectively addressed the crisis that we're seeing. And so everyone keeps calling it a bipartisan bill. And I'm curious what your thoughts on that. Do you genuinely believe this was bipartisan? Senator Langford was part of the negotiations. And so I'd just like to hear your perspective on that.
So this did originate from the Senate, and the Senate is controlled by Democrats. And so anything bipartisan is going to obviously be Democrat leaning, just given the makeup of the Senate. The House passed their version of border security, HR 2. That, I think, for a lot of conservatives is probably more what you're looking for, more asylum fixes. But you know what? I'm not going to go ahead and completely criticize the Senate bill, the bipartisan bill. It is bipartisan in the sense that it is not a wish list of Democrat priorities. There is not a huge pathway to citizenship for dreamers. There is funding for things like detention that Democrats have traditionally tried to defund. So maybe it's not bipartisan in the traditional sense of 50-50 support, but it certainly is not a Democrat wish list.
No, I think that's a really good perspective, May. I think really making sure that we're honest about what's in it is actually where we're going to get to having people being informed and making an informed decision about the bill itself. And actually, I really like your statement on your recent blog post for IWF on this bill specifically, which you can read, by the way. You can find it at iwf.org. And you said the bill basically contains a bunch of stuff that sounds good, but is deeply problematic. I do feel like that's a bunch of politics these days, where the language sounds great, but perhaps on execution, there's some challenges. But one of those things is the border bill has created an expedited removal process for non-detained aliens. And expedited sounds great. That sounds like something exactly what we want. But what does that mean in reality?
Yes. So I think part of the problem is the lack of immigration expertise for some of the senators. Even James Langford, who is negotiating this bill. But right now, if you come across illegally, you're supposed to be, so if you're caught within 14 days of entering within 100 miles of the border, you're supposed to be processed through expedited removal, which cuts out some of the red tape and would allow you to be returned in as soon as 10 days. Sometimes it takes 40 days, but usually a period of days while you are in detention. So we keep you and then we remove you. The problem is there is not enough detention space for people coming over. And so people are being caught and released. And once they are released, you really want to process the people who are being detained first. You want those people to be at the top of the list. You want to get them out because it's faster, easier, you know that they're there. So once you're released, these people are given court dates and told to show up. But the court date, unfortunately, because we have millions of people who are in the asylum backlog, it is 10 years into the future. And then once you've got your court date for 10 years from now, you become part of society, and really judges think about that in deciding whether or not to deport you. You have a job, you're contributing, and then you're basically here. So the goal is we need to get people detained and processed out of here. And so what this bill does, it says we're going to do a faster process for even people who are released. The problem there is once you're released, you're released. I mean, you are part of the community. Oh, you're going to put an ankle bracelet on someone. They already, went through cartel-ridden Mexico, paid smugglers, and crossed our border illegally. They're going to cut this. So it actually just incentivizes Border Patrol to release people. And then the way that they're speeding up the process is, instead of cutting out some of the appeals process and red tape, what they're doing is actually making it more likely for you to get asylum. So their speed is, we're going to give you asylum, give you asylum, give you asylum. And yeah, that might be faster. And yeah, that there's going to be less of a backlog. But what that actually means is just creating more of a flow of migrants into the United States.
That's an interesting point. I was having lunch with a super educated friend of mine. I mean, she reads a lot. She's very engaged. And she thought that caught and release meant that we catch them at the border and we release them back to Mexico. She had no idea that was, we caught them here and then we release them back into our society. And I think it's a very good point that you bring up, because 10 years is a long time from now. And so they do become part of society. And as you said, judges do weigh that during determination. And also, can you kind of speak to the difference between all the different categories of those who come over? So humanitarian, parole, asylum. Can you speak to all of that a little bit, just to make sure we understand the different kind of categories that people could fall under?
Yeah. So when someone comes across illegally, like I said, expedited removal is supposed to attach. So you're supposed to be detained and removed. There are really no exceptions to that. But the Biden administration has created a fake exception called parole. Now, parole does exist in law. So if, for example, you are a migrant who is drowning, dying in the Rio Grande, if you are a migrant who is pregnant, giving birth on the border, for humanitarian reasons, you, on a case-by-case basis, the law says case by case, you can be brought into the United States, given the care that you need, and then processed however you need to be processed, and so on. So this humanitarian case-by-case relief is now being blown out of the water by the Biden administration, and Obama did this too, to say that instead of doing case-by-case, we're saying, like, in general, Guatemalans, in general, Haitians have a humanitarian need, and so we are going to just let them in completely. So now you are still technically an asylum seeker. We're eventually going to ask you to leave. This parole is temporary. I mean, there are some sort of loose rules around it, but you are no longer part of this expedited removal process, and you've been given an indefinite leash to come into the United States. So this is transforming people who should be expedited removal into parolees without any legal authority at all.
And you speak to that again. I'm going to highlight your blog because I think it's fantastic, and it's called "What's in That Bipartisan Border Bill Anyway." It's on IWF.org, because you also highlight the kind of the trustworthiness of the process and why that's super important, particularly as many Americans have difficulty trusting all things related to the government at this point. And so you spoke a little bit about the parole process, but ultimately this bill created a lot of gray area. It created a lot of gray area in the parole process. You spoke a little bit too right there, but if you could delve a little deeper, and then also, what is the president's role in all this? You mentioned Biden specifically and Obama previously. What can the president do if the president can do anything at all?
Yeah. So in 1996, there was President Clinton and Newt Gingrich came together and created the last really big immigration bill that we've had. And the purpose of that bill was to delete gray area. You are either here lawfully and you can work, and we're going to make sure that you've got everything you need to be set up for success. But if you're not here illegally, then you're going to be detained and you're going to be removed. And so that way, we don't have questions about what your status is and all these legal fights and so many resources being sucked in gray areas. The 1996 bill, very much designed to put people in bucket A or bucket B. Then you've got Obama, who came along and created all these parole processes. DACA, if you are a child of somebody who came here illegally, we're going to give you sort of fake status. So just creating all of this gray area. And the problem really is, A, it's very unfair to people who come here legally. B, we're no longer able to control our immigration system. So what if we want more nurses? The thing we want is more nurses. Through our legal immigration system, we can say, we are expanding an H-1B program for nurses. So it totally gives up control over our immigration system. And then the people in the gray area themselves are not helped out because they don't have access to the things that they need to be set up for success, like work authorization. But at the same time, you can't just give them work authorization, because then it incentivizes massive illegal immigration that, again, we can't control. So that's really the point of a lot of Biden's actions. And there are a ton of things that presidents can do about this. And I think the biggest one, the one that President Trump did that worked the most, was remain in Mexico, the migrant protection protocols. So we actually, in the Trump administration, faced a huge spike in illegal immigration. In May of 2019, our numbers were at their highest, 144,000 apprehensions a month. We were in the process of getting MPP set up. And once it was set up, we lowered that by 100,000 a month. So we went down to 52,000 apprehensions a month. So the remain in Mexico, also known as MPP, Migrant Protection Protocols, that is a pure executive action that President Biden ended on, as soon as he came into office.
And it was effective. So it sounds like it was effective. And that's ultimately, I think, some of the frustration has been there are things that at the executive level could be done immediately. And then there could actually be some genuine dialogue, which sounds like, because there may perhaps are some gray areas, there are some loopholes that perhaps do need to be closed, that maybe, Clinton and Newt Gingrich didn't actually foresee what could be happening. And so there's some things that still need to be discussed. And the intent of this bill was to begin addressing them. But ultimately, it sounds like what it did was create more gray area rather than just dispel it. And one of the numbers that we kept hearing in one of those areas, I think that people were very, very keen on and kind of targeted, focused on, was that 5,000 number we kept hearing about when it referred to emergency closure. And so if you could just take a moment and explain what exactly that means, that 5,000 number. You referenced that a little bit earlier, but talk through what that 5,000 number means in reality, and how that could potentially pose a problem.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest gives to Republicans is this shutdown authority, that when border crossing numbers reach 5,000 over the course of a week, so the 7-day average is 5,000, that there's a presidential shutdown authority. The president can override that. He can wait for a few days if for whatever reason he wants 5,000 plus to come over per day. But in general, it will be triggered, though, like I said, it doesn't have to be. So if this is the biggest give, you have to make sure that you're actually getting something good. And the problem with 5,000 is a few things. One, it is crazily high. So the number of crossings between ports of entry for Biden in his record-breaking year was slightly above 5,000. So the numbers that you often hear are around 8,000, because that counts between ports of entry and at ports of entry. But if you're just looking at illegal between port of entry crossings, it's in the 5,000 range already. So it basically perpetuates what we're seeing. And like I said, normal is somewhere closer to the 1,000 number. This bipartisan border bill would demand that ports of entry process at least 1,400 asylum seekers per day. So the mandatory number that they need to encounter is more than what you would normally see in a standard year of President Biden were not your president. So that's the thing. It actually requests more immigration, more illegal immigration than even is average. And so it's hard to say that's a shutdown authority because you're actually still increasing the numbers. You know, it's not nothing. There's something there, but it's just not, it's not enough of a give to say, okay, I'm going to accept this wonderful thing in order to, you know, to approve things I don't like.
Well, it's a double-edged sword, right? So, and also, I mean, processing 14,000 a day, kind of that demand, I mean, that requires a substantial amount of capacity and capability. I know the border bill addressed some of that, right? There was that 3.2 billion to create detention capacity, for example. So that did exist in there, but just, do you think that there would have, with the kind of parameters in the bill, the possibility of even processing that volume every day? Do you think that actually would have been likely?
No. So detention capacity funding is great, but how long does it take to build a new something on the border? It's going to take ages. Government contracting is very slow. So money for detention capacity is not something that you see turn on tomorrow. Of course, you can, like in the Trump administration, we put up temporary tents and they were, you know, this AOC went down and wept and when she looked at them, but they're very, very expensive. These temporary facilities are outrageously expensive. So it doesn't, the money doesn't go very far. So if Biden actually cared about increasing detention space enough to process migrants, then what he would do is what we did is you would partner with local jails, local communities, and say, hey, can you give us half of your county jail in order to process people, 100 people a day? Could you have, room for 100 a day, something like that? And if you can make those arrangements, then I think you can do a little bit of something. But because Biden shut down a ton of detention centers. He shut down these partnerships. His first few years in office, he requested less funding for detention space. You know that this money is not actually going to be used to create an additional detention space because Biden has the authority right now. He currently has the authority. He can make these partnerships. He can make this work. He can turn on some of the space that he turned off, and he chooses not to do that.
But I think, man, that's again a very, very important point where I think that oftentimes it gets lost in the conversation, especially around the debate around the bill, was the kind of lack of attention on executive authority and what President Biden could right now do to really address this crisis. And I want to refer back to the beginning of our conversation. We said it is a crisis. You and I obviously agree it's a crisis, but most of America agrees it's a crisis. I think the most recent poll that looked at is 78% of Americans believe the border is either a crisis or a major problem impacting our country. So you're speaking a little bit to what the president could do right now. Obviously, you served in the previous administration, so you were very privy to all the executive actions that can be taken by the president. What else can be done by the president right now that could help effectively stem the tide of migration? So you mentioned these partnerships. You talked kind of about current enforcement of things that were previously enforced and are not enforced, or released back into Mexico. What else comes to mind for you when it comes to executive action that President Biden could take right now?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So asylum is a very discretionary tool. The Attorney General has a lot of authority to make rules around asylum. So one of the things that we really tried to do is say, one, if you are coming here as an asylum seeker, right now there's like an initial bar that you have to hurdle to say, I think that I'm entitled to asylum. And once you're past that initial bar, your court processing takes so much longer. So really you want to make sure that that initial bar is set at a reasonably high level so that you're actually letting through the people who are real asylum seekers and you're blocking the people who aren't. And so the Attorney General and President Biden have the authority to create rules to heighten that bar. President Trump did that, and President Biden removed those. So that's one thing, is creating what's called the credible fear bar, credible fear hurdle. You want that to be high enough to just let past the good claims. Another thing that Biden has...
Wait, Megan, I'm going to pause you right there real fast. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. So just so, what would be a good claim? So for those that don't understand, for those that are applying for or claiming asylum, what is that threshold, or what do you typically see in that population?
Yeah, so I've sat in on some of these when I went on my border trip with the Trump administration. We went all the time. And what you'll typically see, and these are oftentimes Spanish speakers, so you've got a translator, so you're mostly listening to the translator. But what they will say is very generically, I'm in fear of my home country because of my, and then they'll fill in the blank. And it could be religion, but it even could be gang violence. So what asylum was meant to do was prevent the Holocaust. It was meant for, if you are being killed by your government for something that you cannot control, something that is so personal to you, like your religion, your race, your sex, something like that. If the government is coming in and killing you, then you should be allowed to be a refugee. And if you just traipse across, then an asylee. And we're going to screen and make sure, is the government killing you for something that you can't control? Gang violence is a weird one, right? Because it's not the government that's killing you, it's gangs, and it's not for something you can't control. It's just you live in a really bad neighborhood. And if we actually just let everyone in who lived in a bad neighborhood, we would have the entire world basically living in our country. So that's part of what it requires to increase that credible fear hurdle, which it should be more than a credible claim that you might have asylum, which has been interpreted as a 10% likelihood. If you can establish a 10% likelihood that you're entitled to asylum, you get passed. That 10% means you're probably 90% of these claims are going to be thrown out. So what you'd be looking for actually is probably somewhere closer to a 50 or a 60% likelihood. And so, well, tell me, I need some details. I need some proof. Give me proof that the government is going to kill you. Give me proof. Did they come after somebody who you know? And that type of process. And what you'd actually want is an adversarial process where DHS comes in and they say, this person is from this neighborhood. This neighborhood does not have the government rooting out this person as a Christian. The government does not kill Christians. Like, you'd want that adversarial process rather than someone just giving their story. And what Biden has done unilaterally is rip away that two sides process and just said, we're going to have an asylum officer listen to your story, meaning your facts are never questioned by anyone.
Right. And I can imagine anyone would want to exploit that, especially our enemies. I mean, I thought I saw something a couple of weeks ago about the highest population, kind of increase in population is Chinese nationals, and that they're receiving a substantial amount of information and coaching on how to get into our southern border, specifically over TikTok. And so all that to say, if that threshold is very low, I imagine it would be extraordinarily easy to coach someone to say the exact right thing.
It is. It's coaching. Everybody says the exact same thing. So from country by country, they know what story they should say in order to clear the bar. And what we really tried to do, and I think actually the bipartisan border bill tries to do this too, which is to say, well, just because you live in a bad neighborhood, it's not the government coming after you. Is there a place in your country that you could go instead? Because if there is, you should not be entitled to asylum in America. And so one of the good things in the bipartisan border bill is that it would clarify that type of internal relocation would essentially disqualify you for asylum. Another good thing would be if you are an asylum seeker from Venezuela and you cross through 10 countries on your way into the US, you would be safe and none of those other governments are trying to kill you, and you come to the United States, you should be barred from coming in. And in theory, the Biden administration has given lip service to that idea, but has given so many ways to bypass it that it's not actually part of their policy.
And so I think, I feel like we're coming up on time. And so I feel like the major question as we're talking about all of this, I mean, like, certainly you laid out that there are some positive things in the bipartisan border bill, right? There's always going to be some give to get in a bipartisan process. Certainly some major areas of concern, which is why I think that you saw, the Republicans really push back and say, this isn't exactly what we were looking for here. And I feel like the major question, or perhaps it's the $118 billion question, would this bill have actually secured the border? Would it have effectively stemmed the tide and addressed the crisis we're seeing?
So I'm somebody who I would have taken basically anything. I mean, it's so bad right now that I really would have taken anything. But the thing needed to actually handcuff the Biden administration, because the problem is currently it's not our laws. It's already illegal to cross illegally. It's, our asylum requires that the government be basically trying to kill you. And it is a lack of will of enforcement. And unfortunately, the bipartisan border bill does not add anything that would actually change the Biden administration's processes. And it would instead do things like eliminate the adversarial process in the expedited removal process, letting people get asylum easier. It would basically cement in a mandatory, even during the shutdown, that you have to process more people than actually should be processed in a day. And it would not shut down parole. So this case by case parole that Biden has exploded, it would basically say, now you have to consider the individual alien. Okay, well, that's the same as case by case. It doesn't add any of the restrictions on the Biden administration that would need to. So it just doesn't do enough. Is it still worth signing on to a bill that doesn't do enough? Unfortunately, no, it's not, because you take away the appetite to then fix the problem. The American people think that you fix the problem. The Senate thinks that you fix the problem. And so you sort of wipe your hands of it when what you've actually done is either nothing or in some cases made the problem much worse. And so what we really need is actual border security. And I think that you have to hold out for real border security.
And it sounds like this is something that it's also a matter of political will. So it's not just a bill that would need to be passed. It sounds like it is truly at the executive level, someone that has the willpower, the desire, and the capability to do that. And we're not seeing that. So even kind of border bill aside, it sounds like executive action wise, there could be some benefit there. You laid out a few and I interrupted you. I apologize for that, because I would have loved to hear all the other ones. But you clearly delineated that there are some things that President Biden could do right now that would be extraordinarily helpful and beneficial in stemming the tide of migration. But we are unfortunately at time. May, you are fantastic as always. I'm going to plug again your blog, What's in That Bipartisan Border Bill Anyway? It's on IWF.org. We'll also have a 60-second takeaway document for those who want to read something a little bit shorter and get some just kind of quick bullet points out of it, just so that you can understand for yourself what's in the bipartisan border bill and how to think about it. So thank you so much for joining us. May, it's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Thanks, Megan.
Yeah, and then from everyone here at IWF and our sister organization, IWN, thank you for all joining us today. If you aren't already a member of IWN, Independent Women's Network, I encourage you to join today. IWN engages around multiple policy issues that enhance people's freedoms, opportunities, and well-being. Plus, members gain access to our regular programming and other informative resources. You can visit iwnetwork.com to learn more. And don't forget to register for hashtag IWReads with Abigail Schreier about her book, Bad Therapy, Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up. And that's on Thursday, March 28th at 1 p.m. on iwnetwork.com. So thank you again for joining us. It's been fantastic. And again, go to iwf.org or iwnetwork.com to find out more.